My father always loved my brother more, and it wasn't a secret, it was the law in our family. My name is Alice, and I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where our home smelled like wood and varnish from the family business, a furniture company that my dad built from the ground up. Matt, my younger brother, was his golden boy, his pride, his future. "He's going to run the company someday," my dad would say, patting Matt on the back while I stood by, holding my ideas that no one wanted to hear. And then Dad died, and the will turned everything upside down. I got 95% of the company, and Matt got just his favorite old cars. But then, as a child, I didn't know that justice could come so late and so quietly. It all started when we were little. Matt was born when I was 3, and I remember my dad holding him up like he was a treasure he'd been waiting for all his life. I was sitting on the floor playing with wooden blocks and watching my mom smile as my dad whispered that Matt was his heir. I didn't understand what that meant at the time, but I felt a coldness, the kind that comes when you're pushed aside. I was older, but to him, I was just Alice, the girl who was supposed to be quiet and not get in the way. Dad liked to say that Matt was born for great things. He would take him to the shop when he was 5, sit him on his knees and show him how to cut wood, how to sand boards. I would reach for them, ask to see, but my dad would wave me away, saying it wasn't for me, that I should help my mom in the kitchen. Matt laughed as he held the hammer, and I stood in the doorway, clenching my fists, and felt the anger growing inside me like a weed. I didn't want the kitchen, I wanted the shop, the smell of the shavings, the buzz of the saws. But my dad only saw Matt. As we grew up, it got worse. I was doing better in school, A's in math, ideas for new designs that I drew at night. I'd bring them to my dad, hoping he'd praise me when he saw me, but he'd glance over and grumble that it wasn't bad, but Matt would do better when he grew up. Matt was barely getting C's, skipping classes, riding bikes with his friends, but his dad called it boy stuff. He bought him his first set of tools when he was 12, and he bought me a dress that I had never worn. I hid it in the closet and kept painting, promising myself that I would prove my worth. The company was his life, and he saw it in Matt's hands. He called it Wilson & Son before Matt could even read. I remember when I was 16, I came up with a new way of assembling tables, faster, cheaper. I worked on it for weeks, checking the numbers, the drawings. My dad looked at it, huffed, and said it was nonsense, that Matt would come up with something more practical when he got down to business. Matt sat next to me, smiling, and I felt the hatred boiling inside me, not for him, but for my dad, who was blind to me. I crumpled up that paper and left, but I didn't give up. Matt knew he was the chosen one, and he took advantage of it. He bragged to his friends that he would become a boss someday, that his dad trusted him with everything. I worked in the company after school, I cleaned the shop, learned from the workers how to cut, how to assemble. I knew every screw, every angle, but my dad didn't see it. He would call Matt to meetings, even though he just nodded and yawned, and I would sit at home, looking through the accounting he left on the table. I would find mistakes and suggest changes, but he would brush them off, saying that Matt would take care of it when he was ready. I bit my lips until they bled, but I kept my head up. I could have left everything, found another way. But I stayed, not for his sake, but for my own. I loved that company, its smell, its rhythm, and I couldn't give it to Matt just like that. I worked quieter, harder, hoping that one day my dad would see. But he didn't, not in his lifetime. I spent years in my brother's shadow, but I didn't sit idly by. I worked my ass off, even though my dad couldn't see it. My name is Alice, and while Matt basked in his praise, I quietly wove myself into the family business, a furniture company that was buzzing in our Ohio town. I knew every nook and cranny, every number, every trick, but I remained invisible to my dad. He kept telling me that Matt would be in charge someday, and I bit my nails to prove to myself that I was worth more than his blind faith in him. And when he died, I didn't know that his will would be my excuse. 95% of the company went to me, and Matt got only the cars. But then I was still struggling in the dark, waiting for a chance that I thought would never come. After high school, I didn't go to college, not because I didn't want to, but because my dad said it was a waste of money for a girl. Matt, on the other hand, got a management course, even though he failed half of the classes. I got a job in a company. At first I cleaned up shavings, carried boards, and mopped the floor. The workers laughed, calling me the little helper, but I was not offended. I listened to them talk about cutting, gluing, and how to save wood. I learned by holding the saw when no one was looking, and at night I drew plans, new designs, ways to speed up the work. I would hide them in a drawer, knowing that my dad would dismiss them. Matt joined the company later, at 18, with a smug smile and his father's blessing. He was given an office, although he didn't know which end to pick up the hammer. I sat in the corner of the shop, counting orders, checking the invoices that my father left on the table. I would find mistakes, missing numbers, overcharges, and correct them, quietly, without praise. Once I suggested changing the supplier, which would save thousands. Dad looked at my notes, hummed, and said that Matt would think about it when he became boss. Matt didn't even look at it. He was driving around in his dad's car while I sat over the papers until midnight. I became the company's shadow, invisible but indispensable. Workers started coming to me when something broke or the numbers didn't add up. I knew how to fix an old saw, how to convince a customer not to cancel an order. Once I saved a big contract, hotel furniture that Matt had forgotten to ship on time. I made calls, made arrangements, ran around the shop to make sure everything was on time. The client stayed, and my dad praised Matt for his good work. I stood next to him, clenching my fists, and saw Matt smiling as if it was his fault. I didn't scream. I went back to my desk and continued working. Matt, on the other hand, was a king without a crown. He was lounging in his chair, drinking coffee, telling stupid jokes. His dad would call him to investor meetings, even though Matt would mix up the numbers and yawn. I listened through the door, wrote down what he missed, and corrected it later, quietly, so no one would notice. Once, he missed a deadline for a batch of chairs, so I got up at 5 to get it done, and my dad didn't even know. He thought that Matt was studying, and I was just a ghost keeping everything afloat. I hated him for that, not Matt, but my dad, who only saw what he wanted to see. But I didn't give up. I read business books that I stole from my dad's desk, studied at night when everyone was asleep. I came up with a new line of tables, simple but stylish, that could be exported. I showed the drawings to old Jack, the foreman in the shop, and he nodded, saying it was brilliant. I asked him to make a prototype and we hid it in the corner. I dreamed of showing it to my dad, but I was afraid he would say it was stupid, that Matt could do better. The prototype stood there, gathering dust, but I kept it in my heart as proof that I could. My dad had been sick for the last few years, and I could see him getting weaker. I worked even harder, taking over his paperwork, negotiating with suppliers, keeping the company on its feet. Matt, on the other hand, disappeared. He was driving cars, drinking with friends, saying that he was resting before the big start. I didn't complain. I knew that if I fell, everything would fall. But my dad didn't see it. He was lying in bed whispering to Matt that he would lead the company into the future, and I was standing in the doorway holding his medication, feeling the anger choking me. Would they ever notice me? I didn't know, but I kept going. When he died, I thought it was the end, that Matt would get everything, and I would be left empty-handed and with dust on my drawings. I was expecting nothing but another blow. But I didn't know that my dad was hiding something inside of him, something that would go off like a bomb and change everything. I could see him melting, his rough hands that once cut boards became thin, his voice, which thundered in the shop, dropped to a whisper. I took care of him, even though he did not ask for it. I brought him medicine, cooked his meals, sat by his bedside while my mother cried in the other room. Matt came in rarely. He would come in for an hour, grumble about the weather, and promise my dad that he would take care of it. I would see my dad smile at him, weakly but warmly, and I could feel the knife twisting inside me. I was there every day, and he only saw Matt. The company kept me going in those months. I would get up at 5, go to the shop, check orders, yell at suppliers who were delaying wood. The workers knew that I was holding everything together, but my dad didn't see it. He was lying in bed, holding Matt's hand, whispering that he would lead the business into the future. I stood in the doorway, listening, and felt anger and powerlessness choking me. I could have dropped everything and left, but I didn't. I stayed, not for his sake, but for my own sake, for the sake of the company I loved more than he could have ever imagined. He died quietly, in his sleep. I was there, sitting next to him, holding his cold hand, when his chest stopped rising. My mom was sobbing, Matt stood aside, looking at the floor, and I felt empty. I didn't cry, I couldn't. I loved him, but I hated him at the same time, and when he was gone, I thought it was over. I imagined Matt taking over the company, my dad leaving him everything, the shop, the offices, even my blueprints gathering dust in the corner. I prepared for this by gritting my teeth, promising myself that I wouldn't break, no matter what happened. The funeral was quick, a small crowd, a few words from the priest, the smell of flowers choking me. Matt stood there in the black suit his dad had bought him for graduation, nodding to people like he was already the boss. I could see him whispering to his friends, smiling through his tears, and I knew he was waiting for his crown. My mom was holding my hand, but I could feel her coldness. She too saw Maddie as the future, and me as just a daughter who needed to be there. I stood there, looking at the coffin, and thought, what have you left me, Dad? Something or nothing. The day of the will reading came a week later. We gathered in my dad's office, me, Matt, my mom, and the lawyer, an old man with shaky hands. I sat in the corner, holding a cold cup of coffee, and felt my heart pounding. Matt was slumped in his chair, his feet up on the table, smiling, confidently, as if he already knew he was going to get everything. My mother was nervously twirling her handkerchief, and I was looking out the window, preparing to hear that the company was his, that I would only get an old chair or a few dollars as a souvenir. I didn't expect justice. My father had never been fair to me. The lawyer started reading, his voice dry as the paper rustling in his hands. He listed the little things, a house for my mom, some money in the account, a few old things for relatives. I listened, holding my breath, and waited for the punchline. Matt sat there smiling, as if this show was put on for him. I imagined him taking the keys to the shop, throwing away my blueprints, destroying everything I had kept afloat. I clenched my fists, promising myself that I wouldn't cry, that I would find a way to go on living, no matter what happened. I sat there, feeling the air getting thicker, and I didn't realize that the next words of the lawyer would break everything I knew. The moment the lawyer read out the will tore apart everything I knew about our family, like thunder splitting the sky. The lawyer sat at the table, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. I clutched a cold cup of coffee as I watched Matt slumped in his chair, his legs swinging as if he were already king. My mom was holding a handkerchief, her eyes darting between us, and I could feel her pulse pounding in my temples. He started with Matt, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. To my son, Matthew Wilson, I leave my vintage car collection, all 5 cars I've collected my entire life. Matt stood up, his eyes flashed, and he looked at me as if to say, "Look, I won." I squeezed the cup tighter, waiting for what would happen next, that I would get some trinket, maybe an old watch or a few dollars to say goodbye. But the lawyer coughed and continued. "To my daughter, Alice Wilson, I leave 95% of the shares of Wilson Furniture." Silence fell like a stone in water. I felt the air stop in my chest, my mom inhale sharply, Matt froze, his smile melting like wax under fire. The lawyer didn't stop, his voice hardening, as if Dad was speaking through him. "The remaining 5% is divided among the other shareholders. Alice has always been the smarter one, and I believe she will take the company further than I could." I sat there, unmoving, feeling the words crashing into me like shrapnel. Matt jumped to his feet, his face flushed, his eyes burning. I could see his fists clenching, his jaw trembling, but I didn't flinch. I looked at him, at his shock, at his anger, and I felt something sharp, not joy, not relief, but something like a knife returning to an old wound. My mother grabbed the table, her handkerchief fell to the floor, and she mumbled something incomprehensible, as if she couldn't believe her ears. The lawyer folded the papers, looked at us over the top of his glasses and quietly walked out, leaving us in this chaos. I did not move. I sat there, holding my cup, and felt everything in me buzzing. 95%. The company was mine. The shop where I washed the floors, the offices where I corrected other people's mistakes, the employees who came to me for help, all of this now belonged to me. And my dad's words, "She was always smarter," were playing in my head like a broken record. I wanted this recognition all my life, but now that it came, it was as cold as his body in the coffin. Why didn't he say it earlier? Why had he waited until he was dead to give me what I had gnawed away at myself? Matt turned to me, his eyes wild as an animal's. I could see him struggling with the shock, with the anger, with the truth that Dad had chosen me. He didn't say anything then, he just stood there, breathing heavily, as if he wanted to blow the table to pieces. I could have smiled, thrown his arrogance in his face, but I didn't. I looked at him, holding my head high, and felt something inside me crack. It wasn't triumph, it was pain mixed with a strength I hadn't expected. My mother raised her handkerchief, her hands were shaking, and I could see her trying to say something. But I didn't listen. I stood up, put the cup on the table and left the office. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. I went to the shop, where the saws were buzzing, where it smelled like wood, where I had spent years being invisible. I stood there, looking at the machines, and felt the truth sink in. It was mine. But I didn't know what to do with it, whether to scream with joy or grief. I knew that Matt would not give up, his pride, his belief in himself would not let him rest. And as I stood among the shavings, I asked myself, is he ready to fight? Am I ready? My dad gave me company, but he left me with a war I didn't ask for. Matt exploded that evening. I was sitting at home, flipping through old company records, when he burst in, his footsteps thundering across the floor like a hammer on wood. His face was red, his eyes were burning, and I felt the air compress. He threw the keys to one of Dad's cars on the table as if it were a challenge, and I could see his hands shaking with rage. He didn't scream right away. First he stood there, breathing heavily, as if he was going to strike. I didn't flinch. I looked up from my papers and stared at him, waiting for him to do something. And he did. His voice cut like a saw as he accused me of stealing his inheritance, of making Dad crazy, of not deserving it. I could have backed away, said it wasn't my fault, but I didn't. I stood up, keeping my hands calm, and looked him in the eye. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, not from his words, but from the years of him taking everything I had built and laughing in my face. I didn't scream, my voice was quiet but hard as steel as I told myself in my mind that this was mine, that I had earned it with sweat and nights without sleep. He stopped, his eyes narrowed, and I could see him struggling with himself, with me, with the truth that my father had chosen me. He left, slamming the door, but I knew it wasn't over. The next day I went to the company. I walked into the shop, where the machines were humming, and I felt my heart beating faster. The workers looked at me, not with respect, but with curiosity, as if they were waiting for me to fall. I gathered them together, standing in the middle of the shavings, and told them that I was now in charge. My voice did not tremble, although I felt cold inside. Old Jack, the foreman, nodded at me, his eyes glistening with warmth, but the others were silent. I knew that they saw me as a girl who mopped the floor, not a boss. But I didn't back down. I handed out the tasks, checked the orders, and went to the office where Matt used to sit, yawning over the papers I was correcting. Matt didn't show up that day, but his shadow was everywhere. I could hear whispers, workers saying he'd called, saying he wouldn't give up, that it was his company by right. I was sitting at my dad's desk, flipping through his notes, and I found something, notes written in his hand about my ideas. There was my plan with the supplier, my numbers, my words about saving money. He had kept them, even though he never told me. I clutched the paper, feeling pain and surprise mix inside me. He knew. He had seen. But why didn't he tell me? Why did he wait until he was dead to give me this? 2 days later, Matt returned, not alone, but with a lawyer. I was standing in the shop when they walked in, his arrogant smile back, though it was trembling at the edges. He was holding papers, waving them around like a weapon, and I knew he would challenge the will. I wasn't afraid. I felt strength growing in me, like a tree breaking through stone. I called my lawyer, my old friend Jack, and we sat down at the table. Matt threw in that Dad was sick, that he didn't know what he was doing, but I could see his words weakening under my gaze. My lawyer laid out the documents. Dad had signed everything a year before he got sick, his mind as clear as crystal. Matt fell silent, his face pale, and I could see his laughter dying out completely. I took control, but I didn't feel any joy. I stood in the shop, watching the saws cut the boards, and wondered if I could hold on to it. Matt had lost the first fight, but I knew him, he would come back, with a new plan, a new rage. And I asked myself if I was ready for the war that my father left me with the company. I held my head high, but inside I felt a tremor, not from fear, but from the weight of what was now mine. Matt didn't give up after the first blow. I saw him several times after my lawyer smashed his claims across the table. He would come to the shop, stand at the gate, his eyes burning and his hands clenched into fists. He didn't yell anymore, he just stared, as if he was waiting for me to stumble. I heard from the workers that he was whispering in the city, calling me a thief, saying that my father had made a mistake. I didn't answer, I worked. I was up before dawn, checking machines, signing contracts, getting the company out of debt that Matt didn't even notice as he yawned in his chair. I kept everything on my shoulders, but I felt his gaze like a cold wind on my back. The company came to life under my hands. I pulled out the old blueprints, the ones I'd been hiding in a drawer, the ones my dad had rejected. I showed them to Jack, and we launched a new line, tables, simple but sturdy, which went over well. Orders came in like rain, and I could see the workers starting to look at me differently, not as a girl who mopped the floor, but as a boss who knew what she was doing. I cut costs, hired 2 new masters, and the numbers in the accounting department glowed green. But every step was like walking on glass. I knew Matt was waiting, that people were whispering, that Dad's decision was still hanging in the air like a ghost. My mom tried to talk to me once. I was sitting at home when she came in, her eyes red and her hands shaking. She sat down across from me, holding a cup of tea, and I could see her struggling with herself. She didn't apologize, she just said that Dad loved us both, that he must have seen something in me at the end. I listened, holding my tea, and felt the pain clenching in my chest. I could have screamed, asked why he hadn't shown it when he was alive, why she hadn't said anything when he was trampling on me. But I didn't. I nodded and looked away. She left, and I was left with silence buzzing in my head. Matt made his last move a month later. I found out from the lawyer that he had sold one of the cars, the one Dad loved the most, a shiny red Mustang, and hired a new lawyer. He was going to challenge the will again, but I was ready. I gathered evidence, my notes, my dad's notes, Jack's testimony about how I kept the company going when Matt was out at the bars. The trial lasted a day, and I stood there, watching his arguments crumble like chips under a saw. The judge threw out the lawsuit, and Matt walked out, his shoulders slumped, his eyes out. I watched him walk away, and I didn't feel joy, only emptiness. I went back to the shop, to the smell of wood and the hum of the machines. I stood there, watching the craftsmen cut the boards, and felt a weight settle in me. This was mine, not just a company, but proof that I was stronger than they thought. But I didn't know if it was worth it. Dad gave me everything, but he took away the chance to hear those words from his mouth. Matt lost, but I couldn't erase the years of him laughing and me biting my nails in the corner. I had won, but the throne was bitter, not because of the fight, but because I was still searching for his recognition within me. Would I ever find peace? I sat in my dad's chair, holding his old lighter, and thought about it. The company was growing, but I felt cold, not from Matt, not from my mom, but from a question that had no answer. Did he really see me? Was it his gift, or was it just one last game? I stood up, walked to the shop, and touched the warm board, feeling the power flowing through me. I walked on, holding my head high, but with a shadow whispering, "Is this enough?"